Hi, everybody. I'm Jennifer Cunningham. I'm the AVP for Alumni Relations here at Lehigh University. And I want to thank you for joining us for today's Mountain Talk with Hilary Stiers, class of 10. So you are still officially called a young alumni, just so you know.
For another few months, yeah.
Yep. She just earned her PhD focused on breast cancer from Rutgers and was a postdoc at Georgetown University's Lombardi Comprehensive Cancer Center when her best friend was diagnosed with breast cancer. So she not only studies it, but it also has affected her deeply in a personal way. And so we're going to hear from Hilary. The way that this works is that Hilary will talk for 5 to 10 minutes and just tell us about her research and her story. And then we'll open it up to your questions. So when you want to ask a question, if you look at the screen at the very bottom, take your mouse and kind of hover it over the picture, and you'll see some icons appear. One says chat. If you click on the chat, you'll see a window come up, and then you can type in your questions there, and I will read them to Hilary. If we run over and we don't have time to get to all of your questions, still write them in the box, and we will ask Hilary to respond and get back to you within a few days. So let's kick it off. Hilary.
Sounds good. So I actually just had a TED Talk released recently, which is kind of what sparked this conversation. And that TED Talk talks a lot about my personal journey from a little bit more of an emotional side through my experiences with having my best friend diagnosed with cancer and my pivot kind of into science advocacy and cancer advocacy. So I kind of wanted to take a little bit of a different angle with this talk, looking more at my education and kind of the different aspects of Lehigh, Rutgers, and Georgetown that led me to where I am today. So I've always loved science. When I was growing up, my dad always said, you know, one day you're going to cure cancer. And I kind of wanted something a little happier than that. I thought I was going to deliver babies. My yearbook post from my senior year says that's what I was going to do. So I went to Lehigh as a pre-med major, and I joined Alpha Gamma Delta, and there I met a group of women who were all behavioral neuroscience majors. I really didn't know what behavioral neuroscience was, but I started to learn about how the brain was impacting the behaviors that we do. And it was a really great opportunity to start taking classes that had a little bit more of a psych component to it. And I also took endocrinology, which is, spoiler alert, what my PhD was in. And I fell in love with, you know, how your brain releases signals, and those signals go to every part of your body to make sure that your body is doing what it needs to do to help you survive. Also, when I was at Lehigh, I was part of the Colleges Against Cancer Club that we had at the time. I helped to organize Relay for Life. My junior year, I was the Relay for Life chair. In my senior year, I was the president of that club. I also participated in the Pennsylvania Youth Task Force, which is a group, all these groups were under the umbrella of the American Cancer Society, where people were raising money and awareness about cancer to kind of pay for cancer research, but also services for people who were diagnosed with cancer. And one thing that I noticed through all of that was that the scientists weren't really there. I was going to these events as a scientist. At the time, I fortunately had not been touched closely by cancer. And so a lot of my reason for being there was because I was interested in the science and the research component of it. And I, you know, so was at that point already starting to recognize that there was this disconnect between scientists and people diagnosed with cancer. I did research under Dr. Simon while I was at Lehigh as well, and had a phenomenal mentor in Carrie Garippa, who helped me to fall in love with running experiments and developing hypotheses so that I could ask questions about what's going on in the world and how to answer it. At that point, you know, I kind of had walked away from the idea of being pre-med and started thinking about getting a PhD. And so at Lehigh, I really learned to follow my interests, not necessarily what I think I should be doing, but kind of more so what I was interested in. So I applied for PhD programs and got into an endocrinology and animal biosciences program at Rutgers. Like I mentioned, the class I took with Jill Schneider was a great intro into endocrinology. And I used that bridge to start learning about how estrogen and progesterone, two common hormones in women, drive breast cancer development. And so I did a lot of things focusing on how mammary glands develop, but then also how that causes cancer to develop. At Rutgers, I also struggled with mental health problems. I think that's a very common issue with people who are doing PhD programs. It's a lot of work and for not a lot of money, and it feels like a lot of times that there's no end in sight. I was fortunate to be able to participate in Hope Lodge in New York City, had a Relay for Life, and I participated in that to kind of make that connection to people who had ever been diagnosed with cancer. I also was a teaching assistant and had an opportunity to work directly with the students and help to rewrite a course at Rutgers about general biology, and that's where I learned about the value of science communication. I was teaching trainees how to not only learn a new topic, biology, but also the language around biology. And as someone who later would go on to work on communicating science with the public, I started to recognize the inverse was true when you're talking to the public. You have to unlearn those words, those very technical terms, to be able to have those conversations with people in the public. When I finished at Rutgers, I was interested in becoming a professor. Like I mentioned, I did teaching. I really liked that part. I had enjoyed my research because I liked asking questions and finding answers. So I wrote a lot of grants and had unique opportunities, it being a cancer center, to have a little bit more of a translational experience and exposure. I attended the tumor boards that the breast cancer program puts on weekly, which is a group of clinical oncologists and surgeons and different types of physicians that discuss patient cases to start to really understand how cancer is treated in the clinic. Because unfortunately, as I was learning, there's a disconnect between clinicians and what's actually happening at the bench when you're working with cells and working with animal models. I also had an opportunity to present to the Georgetown breast cancer advocates, and I'll leave that story for my TED Talk, but just as a spoiler alert, I realized that I really didn't understand that individuals were affected in different ways by cancer treatment. We kind of treated everybody as a whole, and there are some people who would have side effects that might prevent them from taking a drug versus even if it's going to help them to survive. So I'm continuing to move forward and doing my research at Georgetown when Katie was diagnosed with breast cancer in November of 2016, just 6 months after starting my postdoc. And it was a very eye-opening experience for me because I had spent so much time studying cancer, but never really had lived, near or with somebody who had cancer. I went to her chemotherapy appointments with her and had a great opportunity to talk to her physician, who's, a world-renowned clinical oncologist. And I also got to see the patient perspective of going home and dealing with the side effects of your therapies and dealing with the long-term consequences. Around that time, I also started tweeting with a group called BCSM, or hashtag breast cancer social media. I leaned on them as a support, but I also learned from them. So this group is patient advocates, research scientists, physicians who all get together every Monday night to discuss topics related to cancer. And so I learned about the word survivor and how oftentimes we say a survivor is somebody when they finish therapy, but a lot of times that doesn't encompass a person's entire journey. And so it might be better to use that word to describe someone from the point of diagnosis. I learned about clinical trials and the challenges in getting enrolled in a clinical trial, and how not great of a website clinicaltrials.gov is. It's very challenging to navigate. I learned that 1% of all breast cancer, or people living with breast cancer, are men. And like you just saw, I corrected myself because it's not, you can call people breast cancer patients, but they're people living with a disease. They are not defined by their disease. I continued meeting with advocates through metastatic cancer conferences, including the Teresa's Foundation Metastatic Breast Cancer Conference, and started to recognize that there's value in having patient advocates in the room when conversations were happening about research. Up until that point, I had been to a few conferences and patient advocates were there kind of as a checkbox or on the side to say that they were present. And Teresa's Foundation's conference really gave an opportunity to see patient advocates were involved and they were asking questions about what research was happening. And through all of my experiences, the National Coalition for Cancer Survivorship had released an opportunity to become an Elevate ambassador. And through that program, I was selected to be one of the ambassadors. Again, I was the only research scientist in the room. The group was largely cancer advocates. And so I decided to build a program that would start to bridge trainees with, research trainees with patient advocates to start improving science communication to help to have those trainees just deliver their information in a way that, like I was saying earlier, where they were unlearning the things that they had learned, those technical terms, and describing in a way that someone else would be able to understand. This opportunity to have trainees and advocates in the same room having conversations with one another also offered an opportunity for patients to learn about treatments and learn about their disease in a way that is more comprehensive and easier to understand. Ultimately, it leads to collaboration, to come up with new ideas, to have better directions for research. When I started working with patient advocates, noticed that my grants got easier to write because I really knew what the problem was. I knew what patients were facing, what they needed to be, what needed to happen to help them live better lives. And at the end of the day, it also, a program like this would offer a sense of purpose for all of the people who are involved. So trainees can have a sense of purpose in those dark days of being in graduate school, that they know that they're actually helping patients and patient advocates, and the patient advocates have an opportunity to participate in research and help to research to grow. And so I'm continuing to help build this cancer training advocate program. There's a website now, and so we're hoping to see the program grow into other universities. We piloted it over the summer at Georgetown, and next month it'll be in Chicago. So that's what I have for my experiences, and if anybody has any questions, feel free to shoot them my way.
Nice. All right, thank you for that summary. As we said before, if you have questions, you can type them into the chat box, which is, to get that, you click on the little thing. It looks like a cartoon bubble at the bottom of your screen, and type that in, and then I will read the questions to Hilary. And while you're thinking about some of your questions, Hilary, you sort of touched on this, but it sounds like you're sort of a rare bird, that not many researchers or doctors do so many extracurricular activities to come face to face with patients or advocates. Why do you think that is?
A concern about time. And I think that sometimes there's a concern about saying the wrong thing. So it's twofold, right? So it's when you're in graduate school or you're in a postdoc and you're trying to do your research, there's a lot of pressure to make sure that you're spending a lot of time in the lab. However, when you look at, if you can play out your day and see that the value that you're going to get from an hour or two of talking to a patient or a patient advocate will improve your research that much more. It's just getting people to latch onto that idea to see the benefit of it. And the sentiment we felt from, or that we heard from the trainees who participated in the program over the summer at Georgetown, was really that it was impactful, that they felt a huge, they saw how the way that they talked about cancer was changing, and it made them think of different ways to run their experiments, even if that wasn't a cell culture dish. And then there's also this fear that you're going to say the wrong thing. And I try in my presentations and in my workings with advocates to kind of always be transparent that I might, and please call me out on it. It's hard to do that. And so I think that's another challenge that people face as well.
Yeah, yeah. We do have a question. How was your experience at Lombardi?
I had the best experience at Lombardi. So I really, part of that was my mentor. I worked under Dr. Rebecca Riggins. She's very interested in investing in the trainee and making sure that the trainee, whether that's her own or the other trainees in the graduate program or the postdocs, are getting the training that they need and that they're not just there to be hands in a lab. I also, like I mentioned, had the opportunity to work in a little bit more of a translational space. And so I always say that being an endocrinologist, you think of a full system, and then also how the little pieces are affected as well. So I think about a hormone being released from the ovary, your estrogen is released from there. And then you see that, distant, this is in the body, it's very distant. You see that there are effects in the breast. And I think of the system as a whole. I think of when that hormone is released, what's going to happen throughout the entire body. And so when it comes to cancer, I think of what is happening in the lab, what's happening in the patient's perspective, what's happening in the cancer center, policy-wide, and all that kind of stuff. So it was a great experience from that perspective.
Another question says, "Hi, Hilary, what amazing work that you've done. Thank you for sharing your awesome story. Do you foresee your work expanding in any new directions or any ways you want to incorporate what you've learned in a different light?
So at this point, I left Lombardi in May of 2016, or sorry, May of 2019 this year, and now work in healthcare consulting with a focus on FDA regulatory affairs. And so my work now is very different from what I was doing before. Part of that was this idea of science communication and kind of policy and advocacy that drove me kind of to move away from the research bench. But my lab is continuing to do the work. I actually just got an email about a poster that they're presenting in March about that work. So
nice, nice. This is from Dozie here at Lehigh, a faculty member. During your time researching and learning about cancer treatments and the medications, was Taxol a big part of the treatments?
Yeah, so Taxol is a taxane, which it kind of causes the cell to, causes cell death, and is commonly used in breast cancer treatments. So it was always something that we considered as part of the treatments when we were working on them.
Yeah. Julie has a question. Hi, Hilary. Curious about your thoughts on the use of artificial intelligence in diagnosing cancer. Has any of your research included AI?
I have not personally. There were 2 articles that came out in the past week or 2 that talked about AI and diagnosing cancer, if people are interested. One that focused on brain cancer and one that looked at breast cancer in the UK. I'm not sure where the brain one but it's definitely a great way to move, for us to be moving towards that, to find more consistency. Pathologists are phenomenal, and I don't know that we're going to be able to separate the 2, but to kind of continue to reinforce and have them working together is only going to improve our ability to diagnose cancer in the future.
Yeah. Katrina asks, how far are we from making cancer a chronic disease?
So it depends on the cancer type. So we always talk about cancer in a very broad, overarching way, and realistically, cancer is more individualized than that. So it depends on the cancer type that you're talking about. When we think about breast cancer, a lot of times it can be considered somewhat of a chronic disease. My metastatic friends would be very apprehensive for me to call it that because they are still dying every day. In this BCSM community, there's a handful of people that we've lost over the years, and we had someone pass away this week. So it's a reality of the disease, unfortunately. There are a lot of really great treatments that have made it more in the chronic subcategory, where people are living longer despite having metastatic disease. So it's definitely progressing and moving forward in a good way.
Peter asks, do you miss the lab?
I think that's my dad, and no, I don't. I miss the kind of, working in any other sector besides academia. You kind of have a direction and a purpose for what you're doing that's decided by someone else. And so the beauty of being in an academic setting is having your direction be guided by yourself. And so I kind of miss that ability to kind of be a little bit more free in my thinking.
Dozie had a follow-up question about the Taxol. Were there any issues with having readily available access to Taxol?
So I was doing experiments in cell culture, and so from my perspective, I did not. I'm not sure about access to Taxol from a kind of more global for patients perspective.
Let's see. Does your future include more work with doctors and clinicians to help with their communication with patients?
That's a great question. So yes, so I released, my TED Talk came out this week. I also released the website. Like I mentioned, my friend is running the program at Chicago later this month. And so the hope is to continue to build this program and to spread the word and share awareness. Another really great program that I didn't mention earlier is at Cornell. They've had it for years. So when I first came up with this idea, I thought that I was, one of the first to come up with it. And like you had asked earlier, this unique idea of being someone who's interested in communicating with advocates and that kind of thing. So the Cornell group was working more specifically with at the patient level versus kind of a research level. So it was building bridges with the patients at their support groups and that kind of thing. And so there are opportunities to continue growing, and I'm looking forward to seeing where the program continues to go.
Nice. Erin says, just a comment, as a science communication professional myself, I really appreciate your point on who we designate a survivor, how we talk about, describe, and label any subject patient is so important. Researchers and healthcare professionals have the obligation to respect and convey human dignity and successes and journeys. Thank you for your work and perspective.
Thank you. And I mean, I would add to that, I think language matters. You know, I kind of alluded to the idea of learning biology as a language and then regressing and unlearning it and being able to describe it back to people. And that's one of the big things that I've learned in my journey as well, is that language really matters and you should be conscious and careful as you speak. Again, which plays into why some people are apprehensive to get going, but if you kind of come in with a level of respect with the groups that you're doing work with, then I think that's extremely valuable.
Yeah, definitely. While we wait for some more questions from the audience, I noticed that your pinned tweet talks about the next frontiers for cancer research, and one of those is effectively implementing risk reduction or prevention strategies. Can you talk a little bit more about that?
Yeah, so that's another one where words matter. So if you have someone that you know that's been diagnosed with cancer, one of the first questions that they ask is, like, or somebody else will ask is like, how did this happen? Why did this happen? There's no reason a lot of times, cancer comes from mutations that just happen in your body. And, even somebody who has smoked cigarettes, they shouldn't be shamed for having had that happen to them, that they developed lung cancer or a certain type of cancer. And so the idea of risk reduction as a term instead of prevention is one of the big things. And so risk reduction covers all over, health. Being healthy is a very important part to trying to reduce your risk of ever developing cancer. Exercise and diet are really important. And so it's a lot of those research into those specific tracks and those specific areas of what the general population can be doing to reduce their risk.
Right. Well, and even I have a friend who talks about it and says even the notion of like you're fighting cancer can be sort of like, I'm not fighting anything. It's my own body and just,
The fighting terminology is very negative. That's one of the other things that advocates tend to try to push back against, the battle terminology and fighting, because a lot of times it's not up to the person.
Right.
And you'll notice that I don't say that, the person, I say the therapies failed the person, not that the person failed on the therapy, because it makes a difference. It's the therapies. It's that we haven't been able to find a treatment for those people yet. And that, not that the person themselves did anything to fail the therapy.
Right. Another question, what are your recommendations for those trying to navigate clinical trials?
So it depends. I think one of the most unfortunate things about clinical trial navigation is it falls on the onus of the person with the disease or their family and friends. You sometimes will have clinicians who are extremely good at it and they can help out as well. I talk about it in my TED Talk, but I have a friend who was diagnosed with brain cancer, and when we were navigating, it really felt like there weren't a lot of people who were available, clinicians that were available to help, and a lot of times it was, just come onto our clinical trial. So if you're navigating in the breast cancer world, one of my friends has a website that I can add a link to, and she has been curating it for probably a year now. She herself is living with metastatic disease, Christine, and she has pulled terms, because what happens is when you go through the website, you can search for specific terms, but they don't necessarily, on clinicaltrials.gov, but they don't necessarily have all the terms. So you can call it a tumor, you can call it an adenoma, you can call it different things. And so then you lose, the number, you lose some of the trials by not using all the terms. So Christina's compiled all of them for breast. I would say that, first of all, to know that a clinical trial is right for you. As I mentioned earlier, we have a lot of really great therapies for a lot of different cancer types. And so standard of care sometimes is going to be your best bet, because, earlier stage cancers and that kind of thing, we have pretty good treatments for. Recurrences and metastatic disease, in some cases, and again, in some cases may need a clinical trial, or it would be better to be on a clinical trial. And in that case, I would self-advocate. And again, Christine has her website, and there's some other great resources that are online, but.
All right, great. We only have a couple minutes left. I wanted to make sure if there was anything that you were hoping somebody would ask and didn't, is there anything else you want to leave us with?
I think the biggest thing is kind of following what your passions are. So I developed this passion for working with advocates and kind of policy kind of haphazardly as I was going through my journey. I think one of the things that I struggled with always was being a bio major and not really sure what career options were out there. So if people are looking for different kinds of career options, it might be worth going through what you like to do. The reason I ended up where I was is because, you know, as I was in my postdoc and realizing that I didn't really like writing grants, I wasn't really sure about staying in academia. I looked at where I was procrastinating and what I was doing to prevent doing the work that I needed to be doing. And it wasn't that I didn't need to do that work as well. It was, how did I prioritize? The things that I really enjoyed were the things like, I started the postdoc association at Georgetown. So I was able, you know, I was working on scheduling events for that and figuring out what kind of career development activities we would do. I was tweeting on social media with some patient advocates. I was looking up ways to communicate more effectively with patient advocates. And so all of those kind of coalesced into moving towards the field I am now. So kind of trust your, that's more so for the, you know, people looking to figure out where their direction is, but.
Right. Nice. Well, and as you know, the Lehigh is launching a College of Health
Yes.
that will be more about population health, not pre-med or med school. But I think that will open doors for a lot of students that, you know, things that weren't here when you were here.
Right.
So hopefully we'll see more alumni like you. There's one more question from Brenda. Let me see, we've only got a couple of questions, but let me see if I can read this quickly. What thoughts would you have regarding Evista Renzoline for post-radiation treatment? Like you, for the first time, I'm dealing with a close post-menopausal friend who recently was diagnosed with breast cancer, fortunately caught early and had a lumpectomy. However, her doctor recommended Evista and raclosine. But we are seeing it's used for osteoporosis.
I would say to that, I'm not a clinician, so I would trust your doctors. The other piece I would leave everybody with is that if you can get a second opinion, because there are certain times when, you know, it's just good to hear the same thing from two people. One of my cousins just got diagnosed with cancer and is going through lymphoma treatments, and he's doing really well, but you know, he was a little bit concerned about the suggestion from his physician and went to someone else, and that physician echoed the sentiments. And so even just hearing it from someone else makes all the difference.
Right. Okay, we have 1 minute left. Tell us how your friend, did you say her name was Kitty?
Katie.
Yeah, how's she doing?
She's doing well, yeah. So she went through, that was another thing, you know, we studied how treatments, how therapies worked from a drug perspective in a dish. She had to go through a double mastectomy and multiple rounds of radiation, and she's doing great.
Oh, good.
And taking names, so.
Good, good.
Yeah.
All right, we've had lots of people here saying thank you and keep on going and great work. And a couple of people that want to connect with you afterwards, so we'll hook you up with them. But thank you so much. This was fantastic, and I'm so glad that we got in touch. And thank you to everybody on the call. And we'll see you at another Mountain Talk soon. Thanks, Hilary.
Sounds good. Thank you.
Bye.
Bye.